The journey of Apollo 13 was one of NASA's greatest ever achievements. When you look at the list of the achievements they've done over the years, this one features very highly and is in the top 5 of their greatest ever missions. The mission began on the 11th of April in 1970, over 50 years ago, and it really was an amazing achievement. So let's have a look at the mission and let's meet the crew. The crew comprised of 3, as all the Apollo missions did. On the left there we've got the lunar module pilot Fred Haise. In the middle we've got the command module pilot Jack Schweigert, and on the right hand side nearest to me we have Commander Jim Lovell, the astronaut who at the time had got the greatest amount of experience flying in space in the United States. He'd flown in the Gemini 7 mission, he'd flown on Gemini 10, he'd flown on Apollo 8 around the moon and back, and he was to fly now on Apollo 13. A very distinguished and experienced flyer with 2 what they call rookies with him, Fred Haise and Jack Schweigert. And the mission was announced by the American NASA agency. It was announced in April that this mission would be going to the Frau Maro Highlands, which is a part of the moon not too far away from where Apollo 12 landed, but the rocks and the geology of that area were of particular interest. They really wanted to go there. But even before the mission started, there was drama. One of the crew, the original command module pilot, was a chap called Ken Mattingly, and just 72 hours prior to the flight starting, he was replaced because he had been in contact with someone who had German measles. As a result, the backup pilot of the command module, Jack Schweigert, was drafted in to take Mattingly's place. Mattingly was, however, to fly again. He was to fly on Apollo 16 in 1972, again as the command module pilot, but this time he made it as far as the moon and around the moon in orbit. But Apollo 13 was launched in the afternoon of the 11th of April 1970, as you'll see now on this video.
17, guidance release, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8. Ignition sequence has started. 6, 5, 4, 3, 1, 0. We have commit and we have liftoff at 2:13. The Saturn V building up to 7.6 million pounds of thrust, and it has cleared the tower.
Mission control, here we go.
Incidentally, this was the 4th manned launch of a Saturn V rocket, and the Saturn V rocket to this day is the only rocket that has a 100% success rate. They only launched 13 of them, but all of them were successful. Now the Apollo 13 mission was, as I say, going to land in the Frau Maro Highlands. If we look on this photograph of the moon here, which has got the landing sites on, this is the landing site of Apollo 11, this is the landing site of Apollo 12, and when the moon was at this exact phase, this was when the Apollo 13 crew were going to land at this area here in the Frau Maro Highlands. The spacecraft did everything it had to do. It got into orbit, and then they separated out. The lunar module was pulled out of the housing on their 4th stage of the Saturn rocket, and this was the configuration on their way to the moon. The command module Odyssey, this is the command module Odyssey, this is the service module, and of course the famous Aquarius, which was to give them the ability to get back to the Earth. And what happened shortly 2 days after the mission had started, just after they were over halfway to the moon, one of the flight controllers down in the Houston asked them would they stir up the cryo tanks. This was a regular request for the crew, and Jack Schweigert was requested to do this, which basically, when you've got a fluid that's very cold, you need to keep it stirring to stop it clumping, to stop it causing any problems when it's used. So they asked them to stir the cryo tank. In doing so, this would enable to maintain the pressures at these levels here, which you see on this graphic in front of you now. But as Jack Schweigert pressed the button to activate the stirring of the cryo tanks, an explosion occurred. Looking back, after the command module was separated from the service module, they could look back at the service module, and this is what they saw. Absolute catastrophic explosion here, which caused immense amount of damage and basically wiped out the oxygen supply that was held on board the command module, or held for the command module inside the service module. The famous words from Jim Lovell have been paraphrased over the years, but this was the famous time when Houston, we've got a problem. And what basically happened is after Jack flicked those switches and he said, okay, Houston, and then so on.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. Five guns. Go, guys. We've had a hardware restart. I don't know what it was. Okay. Houston, we've had a problem.
And those were the words from Jim Lovell. We've had a problem with a main bus B undervolt, which meant basically that this spacecraft was not drawing the power it should have been from the fuel cells, which was where the problem had occurred. The ground control acknowledged the problem, and they said they would look at it. This is Jack Loosmer, the Capcom, the capsule communicator, as he became known. And in fact, just 30 minutes after the explosion, Commander Lovell looked out of the left-hand window of the spacecraft and stated, "It looks to me, looking out of the hatch, that we are venting something. We are venting something out into space." Loosmer again commented, "We copy your venting," and Lovell responded, "It's a gas of some sort." And what Lovell was actually seeing was the gas, the oxygen tank gas, venting out into space from the last of the two oxygen tanks held on board the command module. This was indeed a major crisis for them. Using a small 16-inch astronomical telescope down in Houston, they were able actually to take a photograph. And this photograph, which isn't particularly clear, but you can see here, this is the fourth stage of the Saturn rocket. This is the cloud of gas that is emanating from the Apollo 13 spacecraft, which is just about here. And this something that was venting out into space, they realized was oxygen, and this was acting as a small thruster. It was actually sending the spacecraft slightly off track, which they could track by using the data they had obtained down on the Earth. Immediately, ground control knew something was very, very seriously wrong, and they gathered round the Capcom's desk. Here you see Capcom here, Jack Loosmer, with a number of the experts down there, some of the astronaut corps as well. And the flight control team that were taking command of this particular situation at the time was Gene Kranz's team. Gene Kranz, the lead flight controller, and he was in charge of the white team. He immediately realised there was a major problem. He handed over to the black team, run by Glyn Looney, and they reassembled in an adjacent room and formed a new team called the Tiger Team. And their express aim was to get the spacecraft, get the Apollo 13 astronauts and their men back to the Earth. To do that, they went into the lunar simulator, the lunar module simulator, which you see in front of you here. It looks like a real hodgepodge of buildings, but basically here's the ladder going up into it, and these are all different screens, so the astronauts on board can see the different effect of using the instruments and the thrusters and everything else. Working extensively in there, and Ken Mattingly was heavily involved in the whole process as well, they were able to work out exactly what they could do using the limited resources of the lunar module. Remember, they were on their way to the moon with the lunar module attached. If it had been the other way around and they were coming back from the moon, well, they would have died. There's no doubt about it. They had no ability to use the lunar module as a lifeboat like they were able to do. So they set off trying to get back to the Earth. Immediately one problem came up, was that of the CO2. The CO2 that the three men were breathing inside the lunar module was far more than was expected, with two men only in the lunar module just going down to the lunar surface and back. And here we had a typical problem, because the command module built by Rockwell had round connections to the air filters, whereas in the lunar module they were square. And famously, they got all the materials that they knew were inside the lunar module and the command module, put them all in a big box, took them into the room where Gene Kranz and his Tiger team were working, put them all on the table and said, right, how are we going to solve this problem? And what they did was this. They cobbled together, it's a wonderful word, it describes exactly what they did. They cobbled together this device here using duct tape, using the manual for the EVAs, the walks on the lunar surface, and using some of the material from the lunar spacesuits that they were never going to be able to use again for this mission anyway. Around the world, there was massive support for them. It was reported throughout the world. Here you've got the headlines in London. In England, you see the Evening Standard over here, and it's talking about the Apollo disaster here and the chance of the men getting returned safely to Earth. In New York, people were praying and also following the mission very closely, and even in Italy. They got these photos from the newspapers in Italy where they basically were saying that the Apollo 13 mission was in dire trouble. Now you might think that on the way to the moon the easiest thing to do when you've got a problem of this nature is just to turn around and come home. Well, that is not the way you can do it in space. They had to return to the Earth via the moon, and they did this by using what they called a free return trajectory. They flew round the back of the moon back towards the Earth using the lunar gravity to sling them back towards the Earth. This is the artist's impression of what it would have been like. They would have seen the far side of the moon, half of which would have been illuminated because you saw the phase earlier, and they headed back to Earth. They just about had enough fuel, not so much fuel, but the fuel for the landing, etc., to manoeuvre the spacecraft, but they had the consumables, the food and the water. Jack Schweiger at this time was taken ill. He developed a kidney infection and was not well at all when he returned to Earth. But eventually, as they got closer and closer to the Earth, they jettisoned the service module, and in jettisoning the service module they were able to take this wonderful picture looking back at the moon from the Aquarius, the lunar module. So they jettisoned the service module, they then went back into the command module Odyssey, and they jettisoned Aquarius, which had been their lifeboat. And this is a photograph of the Aquarius as it leaves the command module Odyssey for the last time. If you look on this very closely, you can see that the footpads, the landing pads of the lunar module, two of them are very clearly visible here. This is the docking bay here, and this is the ladder that Jim Lovell would have walked down onto the surface of the moon at the Frau Maro Highlands. But then came the next problem. When the command module explosion occurred, they did not know what damage it had caused, and they were concerned that the parachutes maybe would not unfurl. After what seemed an interminable delay, you famously hear the words of them, Houston, Apollo 13, do you read? Over. And this went on for something like 90 seconds after they were meant to have heard back from the astronauts. But eventually, in mission control, they managed to get sight of the spacecraft as it came into land, as it came down to the sea on the end of its parachutes. You can imagine the euphoria when those parachutes opened, not just for the men on board, but also for the ground crew. And eventually they landed, they splashed down into the sea, not far from the coast of American Samoa, at a place called Pago Pago, and this was a landing site they'd used previously for Apollo 12, and they were used for Apollo 17, and they also used for 10, and they landed safely at the sea, and the astronauts were brought back onto the aircraft carrier, the Iwo Jima, and of course you wouldn't realise it, but poor Jack Schweiger there is not well at all, but he did recover. And one famous little footnote, however, is that in the film of Apollo 13, that wonderful film by Ron Howard called Apollo 13, starring Tom Hanks actually, when he got back on board the aircraft carrier, he actually met the real Jim Lovell. Jim Lovell had a cameo role in the film, playing the role of the captain of the US Air Force carrier, Iwo Jima. Air Force Navy carrier, of course, Iwo Jima. Back in mission control, the traditional way to celebrate is with cigars. We probably wouldn't do that these days, but here you've got Gene Kranz with a cigar in his mouth, and everyone's clapping and cheering. And there really was such euphoria that they'd managed to do the impossible. They brought back 3 men from the depths of space back to the Earth. They were treated to a ticker tape parade in New York, and thousands and thousands of people came out to see them. You can see Jim Lovell waving here in the front, and here's Jack Schweiger over here. One of the more amusing things to come out of this tale, when they realised how close it was to disaster, was the people who made the lunar module, Grumman. They actually sent an invoice to North American Rockwell, who made the command module, and this invoice was for towing home the command module. And it's a wonderful invoice. If you just zoom in on it here, you can see they charged for a $20 inspection fee. They then charged a towing charge of $1 a mile, very cheap, $1 a mile, but that came to $300,000. And then it came to the loss of the vehicle, $24,000. The battery charge cost them $5 to charge the batteries up, air conditioning $5 a day, and subsistence $40 a day. Total bill $324,750. To my knowledge, Rockwell never paid that bill. Today, of course, as we celebrate 50 years of the launch and the recovery of the Apollo 13 crew, you could go today to Kansas, to the Cosmodrome and Space Center in Hutchinson in Kansas, United States, and you can see Odyssey. And when you look at that, it really, I've not been to see it, but it really is an amazing thing that you can realise the 3 men survived that time after that terrible disaster. And one of the more profound gifts that the crew gave to the mission control team was this mirror. they gave this mirror to them, and this mirror, flown on Aquarius LM7, the 7th lunar module built, to the moon between April the 7th, 11th and 17th, 1970, returned by a grateful Apollo 13 crew to reflect the image of the people in mission control who got us back. And you'll notice the spelling error, which is actually on the actual plaque given to them by mission control, and no one's ever bothered to correct it. As I say, today I was fortunate a few years ago to visit Pago Pago, and I learnt they had a moon rock sample there. And this is the moon rock sample shown against an American quarter, to give you some idea of scale. Very tiny sample of moon rock, not as big as the one we had in the Isle of Man back in 2004, which we loaned from the Apollo 16 mission. But Pago Pago, which is the town, obviously the American Samoan capital city, had in their calendar this year, they were celebrating the Apollo 13 mission. And this is the calendar, and I saw this was on display, and I actually got hold of one. And at the time I went to the museum, one of the local journalists realised I was there, asked me where I was from, and asked could they interview me. So here we go, in the Samoan news, here you've got astronomer Howard Parkin interviewed after going into the museum to see the moon rock samples, and they gave a nice little plug for the Isle of Man, the fact that it came from the Isle of Man. And it was a great thing to see, and it was a great memory for me to realise. I didn't even know where Pago Pago was until then. But when we look back on it, it was often described as one of NASA's greatest missions, but perhaps the most fitting description ever is the words, it was a successful failure. And when you think about it, Apollo 13 is regarded as a successful failure because it brought about the very best of human ingenuity and determination to bring the crew home. And it is often regarded, as I said earlier, as one of NASA's greatest, finest hours. And as the flight controller at the time, Gene Kranz, said, failure is just not an option. Thank you very much indeed. I would just like to leave you with this last picture of the Apollo landing site to finish off the story of Apollo 13, to show you that Apollo 14 actually did land in the Frau Mara Highlands, but that's another tale. Thank you for your attention.